Warning! Before we begin, a quick warning to our listeners. Data and Dissonance is a political and cultural commentary show built on analysis, satire, and unapologetic opinion. We challenge official narratives, question institutions, criticize media framing, and examine power, sometimes aggressively, sometimes uncomfortably, and always without asking permission. If you're looking for safe consensus, partisan lullabies, or talking points spoon-fed by cable news panels, this is not that show. What you'll hear today may clash with your beliefs, offend your sensibilities, or force you to sit with facts that don't fit neatly into your preferred storyline. That's intentional. Free thought requires friction. Truth isn't always polite, and satire doesn't come with trigger warnings. If that's not for you, there are plenty of other places to be comforted. If you're still here, welcome.
This week felt like one of those moments where the world quietly reminds you that everything is connected, even when the headlines pretend it isn't. Overseas, unelected bodies are debating who gets to seize whose money in the name of stability. Here at home, courts are inching closer to redefining executive power in ways that will outlast whatever administration you like or hate. And right here in Colorado, a former county clerk is still being dragged through the system as a warning label taped to the concept of election transparency itself. Different countries, different headlines, same underlying question. Who gets to decide what power looks like? And who pays the price for challenging it? The media wants you to consume these stories separately, in isolation, stripped of context and urgency. They want international stories to feel abstract, federal stories to feel boring, and local stories to feel small. But tonight, we're doing the opposite. We're connecting the dots. We're looking at how global pressure shapes federal authority, how federal authority shapes state action, and how state action lands squarely on real people. Because when systems tighten, they don't tighten evenly. They tighten downward. So tonight, we're breaking it down in 3 moves: the international chessboard, the American power struggle, and a Colorado case that shows exactly what happens when the machine decides you've stepped out of line. No fluff. No headlines read at face value. Just pressure, power, and consequences. I'm your host, Artie, and this is Data and Dissonance, where we don't just ask what happened, we ask why it happened, who benefits, and who's not allowed to ask questions anymore. Joining me tonight is the crew. First up, Brian, bringing that MAGA Fire Friday energy. Brian doesn't tap the brakes, doesn't soften the edges, and doesn't pretend power plays are accidental. When institutions overreach, he calls it exactly what it is. And when accountability disappears, he's the first one lighting the flare. Next, Rachel, the balance point in the chaos. She cuts through spin, separates rhetoric from reality, and reminds everyone that facts still matter, even when they're inconvenient to both sides. When the noise gets loud, Rachel brings receipts and calm precision. Then there's Daniel, our resident pattern finder. While everyone else argues about headlines, Daniel's connecting timelines, incentives, and quiet coordination. If something feels off, he's already asking who pulled the string and why now. And finally, Skylar, the progressive counterweight. She challenges the room, pushes back on assumptions, and forces the debate to confront questions about systems, safeguards, and consequences that conservatives don't always like to wrestle with. One dissenting voice, by design. That's the lineup. No small talk tonight. We've got a lot to cover, and none of it exists in a vacuum. Let's get into it. Before we ever get to American courts, Colorado prosecutions, or media narratives, we have to start where power is most honest, the international stage. Because globally, nobody pretends anymore that this is about fairness. It's about leverage. This week, European leaders quietly moved closer to normalizing something that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago: the indefinite freezing and potential repurposing of sovereign assets belonging to another nation. Hundreds of billions of dollars, seized not because of a court verdict, not because of a treaty violation proven in a neutral forum, but because the geopolitical moment allows it. The justification is always framed as moral urgency, stability, defense, democracy. But the mechanism is raw power dressed up in legal language. And that's the key thing people miss. Once the precedent is set that assets can be frozen, reassigned, or leveraged indefinitely based on political consensus rather than due process, that standard doesn't stay overseas. It becomes a template. What's being debated in Europe right now isn't just about Russia or Ukraine. It's about whether rules are fixed or flexible depending on who's holding the pen. Because when enforcement becomes selective, international order stops being law and starts being permission. This is where the media loses the plot on purpose. They frame it as a morality play. Good actors, bad actors, heroes, villains. Because that keeps audiences emotionally invested without asking dangerous questions. Questions like, what happens when that same logic gets applied closer to home? What happens when financial punishment becomes a policy shortcut? And who decides when an emergency never actually ends?
This is exactly what I'm talking about when I say the mask is off globally. Nobody's pretending this is about law anymore. It's about muscle. You don't need to like Russia, defend Russia, or excuse anything Russia's done to recognize how dangerous this precedent is. If you can freeze and hold a country's assets indefinitely because you've decided they're the bad guy this decade, then congratulations. You've just turned international finance into a political weapon with no expiration date. And once you do that, every country on Earth starts asking the same question: who's next? Here's the part they don't want to say out loud. This isn't stability, it's escalation with a legal font slapped on it. You're telling the world that if you fall out of favor with the right coalition, your money isn't really yours anymore. That doesn't strengthen trust in global systems, it destroys it. And Americans should care because our economy, our currency, and our institutions sit right in the middle of that system. You don't light this fuse overseas and somehow expect it not to burn its way back home.
And that's the through line. Once power realizes it doesn't need permission anymore, it stops asking. Rachel, take this out of the emotion and walk people through why this actually matters beyond the headlines.
What's important to understand here is that this isn't just a political debate. It's a structural shift. International law has always relied on consistency to function. You don't have a global police force. You have norms, treaties, and expectations that rules apply predictably. When those norms are bent for one situation, even one that feels justified, it weakens the entire framework. That doesn't mean there should be no consequences for bad actors, but it does mean consequences should be bounded, defined, and reversible under clear conditions. This week's developments push in the opposite direction. They move toward permanence without resolution. And permanence is where systems become abusive, because there's no incentive to negotiate, no incentive to de-escalate, and no incentive to restore balance. The moment temporary emergency measures become normal operating procedure, you're no longer enforcing law, you're managing outcomes. And that's not a distinction people should be comfortable ignoring, especially Americans who depend on stable global markets whether they realize it or not.
And when outcomes start getting managed instead of rules being followed, that's where patterns show up. Daniel, zoom this out.
This is textbook system behavior. You create a crisis, you introduce an exception, and then you never remove it. History is full of these moments, and they always follow the same arc. Emergency powers become standing powers. Financial controls become behavioral controls. And eventually, dissent itself gets treated as a destabilizing force. The reason this matters isn't Russia, Ukraine, or Europe specifically. It's that the justification language is identical to what we hear domestically when institutions say, "We can't allow questions right now." What you're seeing internationally is the normalization of enforcement without off-ramps. And once that model works, it gets imported. Different country, different scale, same logic. Assets today, access tomorrow, speech the day after that. Systems don't experiment at home first. They test overseas, where fewer voters are paying attention. Then they bring it back polished and pre-approved.
And this is where the philosophical divide shows up. Skylar, you see this differently.
I do, because there's another side to this that can't be ignored. International systems don't exist in a vacuum, and when violations reach a certain scale, traditional enforcement mechanisms often fail. sanctions, asset freezes, and financial pressure are sometimes the only tools available short of military escalation. The concern isn't whether power exists. It always has. It's how it's constrained and whether alternatives are realistic in moments of active conflict. That said, I agree the danger is permanence. Emergency measures should come with explicit conditions, timelines, and oversight. Without that, you risk turning extraordinary responses into default behavior. The question isn't whether consequences are justified, but whether institutions are willing to surrender power once the crisis cools. And history shows that's where things often break down.
And that's the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath this entire debate. Power doesn't like giving itself deadlines. Whether it's global finance, federal authority, or local enforcement, once a system learns it can act without consequence, it starts redefining what normal looks like. That's not an international problem, that's a human one. And as we move from the global stage to the American one, keep this question in mind. If rules are flexible abroad, why would they be rigid at home? Because what happens next doesn't stay overseas. Before we move on, quick pause. Because if you're still listening, you're clearly the kind of person who doesn't outsource their thinking. And we've got something built exactly for that crowd. Over at the Data Dissonance merch store, we've got our signature coffee lineup, because nothing pairs better with questioning authority than a strong cup of coffee. Whether you like it light, medium, or dark, we've got you covered. High Lakes for the early risers who like a clean, smooth start. Rock Creek if you want something balanced but bold. And Bitterroot, our dark French roast for the people who like their coffee strong, unapologetic, and finished with bite. All roasted in the USA, available whole bean or ground, and built for long mornings, late nights, and news cycles that never slow down. We've also got hoodies, hats, bumper stickers, and gear for people who are tired of wearing slogans they didn't write. No corporate messaging, no lecture, just designs that say exactly what you're thinking without you having to explain it. You'll find it all at the Data Dissonance merch store. Support the show, fuel the conversation, and drink something that hits as hard as the truth. All right, let's get back into it. If segment 1 was about how power behaves when it's far away and insulated from voters, segment 2 is about what happens when that same logic starts tightening right here at home. This week, the Supreme Court sent a very clear signal. Not through a dramatic ruling, but through its questions, its posture, and what it appears ready to reconsider. At issue is something most Americans never think about until it's already gone: the balance between executive authority and so-called independent agencies. For decades, we've been told that these boards and commissions exist outside politics, shielded from direct control for the sake of neutrality. But neutrality, as we're learning, often just means unaccountable. What the court is now weighing could fundamentally reshape how much power a president has to remove agency officials who were never elected in the first place. Supporters argue this restores democratic accountability, that if agencies are making rules with the force of law, they shouldn't be immune from the person voters actually chose. Critics warn it opens the door to consolidation of power and political retaliation. But here's the part that gets buried. This debate didn't come out of nowhere. It's happening now because trust in institutions has collapsed, and Americans across the spectrum are realizing that independent doesn't always mean unbiased. It often just means untouchable. This isn't about liking or disliking Trump. It's about whether the administrative state answers to anyone at all, and whether power is something we pretend is neutral until it starts making decisions we can't escape.
This is exactly the moment the system has been trying to avoid for years. The administrative state has operated like a permanent government, writing rules, enforcing them, punishing violations, all while pretending it's above politics. But here's the truth. If you can't be fired, you're not independent. You're insulated, and insulation breeds arrogance. Voters didn't elect the FTC, the SEC, or half these alphabet agencies, but they live under their rules every single day. The media wants to frame this as some kind of authoritarian grab, but let's be honest. What's more authoritarian than bureaucrats with lifetime protection deciding policy with zero accountability? If a president can't remove people who are actively undermining elected priorities, then elections are just ceremonial. This isn't Trump breaking norms. This is Trump exposing how fake some of those norms were to begin with. And the panic you're seeing right now is coming from people who are terrified of losing power they were never supposed to have in the first place.
And this is where the rhetoric starts to outrun the reality. Rachel, slow this down and walk through what's actually at stake legally.
Legally, this is about whether long-standing precedents still make sense in a system that has changed dramatically since they were established. Independent agencies were originally justified as a way to prevent corruption and stabilize regulation. But over time, their authority has expanded far beyond what was envisioned. They now issue rules that affect entire industries, impose massive fines, and shape economic behavior, often with minimal oversight. The question the court is signaling interest in isn't radical, it's foundational. If these agencies exercise executive power, should they be accountable to the executive? That doesn't mean there are no risks. Concentrated power always requires guardrails. But what's often missing from this conversation is proportionality. Independence was meant to limit abuse, not eliminate accountability altogether. If the court recalibrates that balance, it doesn't automatically create tyranny. It forces clarity. And clarity, uncomfortable as it may be, is often preferable to systems that operate in permanent gray zones.
And when gray zones get comfortable, that's when patterns repeat. Daniel, take us there.
This fits perfectly with what we were just talking about internationally. Power hates friction. Whether it's global finance or domestic regulation, the goal is the same. Remove obstacles, reduce accountability, and normalize permanence. Independent agencies were sold as safeguards, but over time, they've become buffers against public pressure. That's not an accident. That's design drift. Systems evolve to protect themselves. What's happening now is less about Trump and more about timing. Trust in institutions is at historic lows, and suddenly the structures that relied on public indifference are being examined under a microscope. That's dangerous for entrenched power. So the narrative shifts to fear. Democracy is ending. Norms are collapsing because fear keeps people from asking who those norms were really protecting. The irony is that the same voices defending unaccountable agencies today will scream about abuse tomorrow when those agencies turn on them.
Skylar, this is where you usually draw a line. Go ahead.
I do, because while accountability matters, consolidation of power should always make people cautious. Independent agencies exist because history has shown what happens when regulatory authority becomes purely political. Enforcement swings wildly, protections erode, and short-term agendas override long-term stability. The concern isn't that these agencies are perfect. They're not. It's that weakening their independence without strong replacement safeguards risks politicizing enforcement even further. That said, the current system isn't sustainable either. Lack of transparency and limited oversight have contributed to the trust collapse we're talking about. If reform is coming, it needs to be thoughtful, not just reactionary. The danger is swinging from one extreme to the other and calling it accountability when it's really just rearranged power.
And that's the tension sitting at the center of American governance right now. Accountability versus insulation. Clarity versus control. Whether this recalibration strengthens democracy or simply shifts who holds the lever depends entirely on what happens next, and who gets to decide when the rules apply. Because once power learns it can redefine precedent, it rarely stops at one branch or one agency. And that brings us closer to home, where the consequences of these decisions stop being theoretical and start becoming personal. Quick reset before we bring this home to Colorado, because if you've made it this far, you're already not buying what the system's selling. Over at the Data Dissonance merch store, we've got the gear for people who are done pretending common sense is controversial. The I identify as non-binary hoodies and bumper stickers are back, along with Make Orwell Fiction Again, Keep Your Feelings Off My Freedoms, and the 1776 designs that apparently scare the hell out of people who claim history doesn't matter anymore. Heavyweight hoodies, clean prints, stuff you can actually wear without it feeling like a costume. This isn't about merch for the sake of merch. It's about backing a show that refuses to self-censor and building something that isn't owned by advertisers, networks, or political handlers. You support the show, we keep saying the quiet part out loud. All right, let's bring it home. Up next, Colorado, Tina Peters, and what happens when transparency becomes a crime. This is where everything we've talked about tonight stops being abstract. No foreign capitals, no Supreme Court hypotheticals. Just Colorado, a county clerk, and a system that decided to draw a line in permanent ink. Tina Peters wasn't a billionaire oligarch, a cabinet secretary, or a party kingmaker. She was an elected local official who believed, rightly or wrongly, that election systems should be auditable, transparent, and open to verification. And for that, she didn't get censured, fined, or voted out. She got prosecuted. The state's case has always been framed as security. Unauthorized access, chain of custody, protecting democracy. But what's been conspicuously absent is proportionality. What's also absent is consistency. Because across this country, election skepticism has been treated very differently depending on who raises it and where. Question outcomes in certain states or from certain political angles and you're called engaged. Question them from the wrong angle and suddenly you're dangerous. This isn't about whether Tina Peters made mistakes. It's about whether the punishment fits the offense, whether intent matters, and whether the justice system has quietly decided that election transparency itself is now contraband. Because when systems criminalize oversight, they aren't protecting trust, they're demanding obedience.
Let's stop pretending this is complicated. Tina Peters didn't steal ballots, rig machines, or erase votes. She didn't profit. She didn't cover anything up. What she did was challenge the idea that election systems are above scrutiny, and for that, the state came down on her like she was some kind of organized criminal. Meanwhile, people who actually lose ballots, violate consent decrees, or ignore court orders somehow skate by with press releases and apologies. That tells you everything you need to know. This case isn't about law, it's about deterrence. It's about sending a message to every clerk, every election worker, every local official. Don't ask questions, don't verify, don't step outside the approved script. Because if you do, they won't just come after your job, they'll come after your freedom. That should scare anyone who claims to care about democracy, because democracy doesn't survive on blind trust. It survives on verification. And right now, Colorado is punishing the very thing it claims to value.
And that's where emotion meets evidence. Rachel, walk people through why this feels so disproportionate.
When you look at the actual conduct versus the response, the imbalance is impossible to ignore. Tina Peters' actions were framed as catastrophic breaches, yet the material harm cited remains largely theoretical. There's a difference between reckless endangerment and intentional corruption, and the justice system is supposed to distinguish between the two. In this case, that distinction feels deliberately blurred. The rhetoric escalated faster than the facts. What also stands out is how narrow the acceptable response window has become. Transparency used to mean audits, verification, and checks. Now it's being redefined as trust the system or face consequences. That's a dangerous pivot, because trust that cannot withstand scrutiny isn't trust, it's compliance. Even people who disagree with Peters politically should be able to recognize that criminalizing oversight sets a precedent that will be used again and not always against people they oppose.
And when precedents get set locally, they don't stay local. Daniel, connect the dots.
This case fits a broader pattern that keeps repeating. When systems feel threatened, they don't debate, they escalate. You see it with whistleblowers, auditors, independent researchers, and now election officials. The crime isn't the action, it's the challenge. Tina Peters crossed an invisible line by refusing to treat election infrastructure as sacred and untouchable. Once that line was crossed, the response was inevitable. What's chilling here is the long-term effect. Future clerks will remember this case. They'll remember that asking the wrong question can end a career or worse. That's how institutional silence is enforced. Not through policy, but through fear. And when fear replaces oversight, corruption doesn't even have to work that hard anymore. It just waits.
Skylar, you've heard the case. You see it differently.
I do, and I think it's important to say why. Election systems are critical infrastructure, and there are real risks when access protocols are violated, even if the intent isn't malicious. Transparency matters, but so do safeguards, and when officials bypass established processes, it can undermine confidence just as much as secrecy can. The concern from the state's perspective is that allowing unilateral action sets a precedent that others could exploit less responsibly. That said, I agree the punishment and tone of this case raise legitimate questions. There should be room to discuss whether criminal prosecution was the right tool versus administrative remedies. Accountability shouldn't automatically mean destruction. If the goal is trust, then the response needs to be measured, not punitive to the point of deterrence.
And that's the line Colorado is going to have to reckon with. You can protect systems without crushing people. You can enforce rules without turning examples into warnings. And you can defend democracy without demanding silence. The question isn't whether elections should be secure. Everyone agrees on that. The question is whether transparency itself has now been placed off limits. Because when oversight becomes a crime, the system stops answering to the people and starts answering only to itself. Up next, Patriot Minute. Tonight's Patriot Minute is for the people whose names never make headlines, but whose integrity is the only reason this country still functions at the local level. The clerks who follow the rules even when they're pressured not to. The election workers who take the job seriously, knowing they'll be blamed no matter what happens. The public servants who believe transparency isn't a threat, but a responsibility. These are not radicals. They're not extremists. They're Americans who understand that trust isn't demanded. It's earned. For generations, this country has relied on ordinary people doing unglamorous jobs with quiet integrity. They didn't ask for applause. They didn't expect protection. They just believed that honesty mattered more than convenience. When those people start being treated as liabilities instead of assets, we lose something far bigger than a case or a headline. We lose the foundation that holds the whole thing together. So tonight, we recognize the Americans who still believe sunlight strengthens democracy, not weakens it. Who understand that questioning systems is not rebellion, but civic duty. And who keep showing up, even when the cost gets higher every year. That's patriotism. Quiet, stubborn, and unshakable. All right, before we wrap this thing up, we're shifting gears. This is the part of the show where everyone gets the floor. No crosstalk, no pylons, no time limits disguised as courtesy. These are the panelist segments, where each voice steps out of the group conversation and speaks directly to you, the listener, about what actually stood out this week and why it matters beyond the headlines. You've heard us break down global power plays, federal authority, and what's happening right here in Colorado. Now you're going to hear how each of these perspectives processes it. Unfiltered, uninterrupted, and fully owned. Some of these takes are going to align. One of them is going to push back. That's intentional. Real discussion isn't about everyone agreeing. It's about exposing the fault lines honestly. So we're going to run through these one at a time. No interruptions, no soft landings, just perspective. Let's start with Brian.
Look, I'm done pretending this is about policy disagreements or procedural nuance. What we're watching across this country, and especially in cases like Tina Peters, is the weaponization of systems that were never meant to be weapons. This isn't about protecting democracy, it's about protecting power. Because if this were really about security, we'd be talking about uniform standards, equal enforcement, and proportional consequences. Instead, we're watching selective outrage and selective prosecution, where the punishment depends entirely on whether you're challenging the right people or the wrong ones. And once that happens, the law stops being blind, it starts squinting. What drives me insane is how quickly the same people who scream about saving democracy suddenly have zero problem with crushing individuals to send a message. That's not strength, that's fear. Fear that if people are allowed to look under the hood, they might not like what they see. Democracy doesn't survive because institutions tell us to trust them. It survives because citizens are allowed to verify. And if the cost of verification is prison, then what we actually have is compliance dressed up as civic virtue. I don't care what letter is next to your name. That should scare the hell out of you.
What frustrates me most about this moment is how allergic the conversation has become to scale and proportion. Not every violation is equal, and not every response should be maximal. The justice system is supposed to be capable of discernment, intent, harm, precedent. And when those elements get flattened into a single narrative, something breaks. In the Tina Peters case, the rhetoric escalated far beyond the demonstrated damage. And that should concern anyone who believes laws exist to correct behavior, not obliterate people. Transparency is not extremism. Oversight is not sabotage. And questioning systems does not automatically equal bad faith. We should be able to hold two ideas at once: that election infrastructure needs safeguards, and that punishing transparency more harshly than actual misconduct creates perverse incentives. When people see that asking questions carries more risk than looking the other way, they don't become more trusting. They become more silent. And silence is not stability. It's just unresolved tension waiting for a spark.
If you zoom out far enough, the pattern becomes painfully obvious. Systems don't usually collapse because of corruption alone. They collapse because they criminalize scrutiny. Every major institutional failure in history shares that trait. The moment questioning becomes a threat, the system has already decided it values control over truth. What we're seeing now is not a one-off reaction. It's a calibrated response designed to shape future behavior. Tina Peters isn't just a defendant, she's a cautionary tale. And here's the part nobody wants to say out loud. These cases are never really about the past. They're about the future. They're about signaling boundaries. Touch this system, ask these questions, cross this line. And here's what happens. That message doesn't just land on election clerks. It lands on auditors, journalists, researchers, and anyone else who might get curious. Fear is cheaper than reform, and silence is easier than accountability. Once you see that pattern, it's impossible to unsee it.
I'm going to be the dissenting voice here because someone has to say this plainly. Systems still need rules, and elections are not an area where improvisation is harmless. Safeguards exist for a reason, and when officials bypass established processes, even with good intentions, it can undermine confidence just as much as secrecy does. The concern isn't transparency itself, it's unilateral action without consensus or oversight. That risk is real, and it shouldn't be brushed aside. That said, where I agree with the rest of the panel is on proportionality and intent. Accountability doesn't have to mean annihilation. Criminal prosecution should be the last tool, not the first reflex. If the response to rule breaking becomes more damaging than the rule breaking itself, the system loses legitimacy. And once legitimacy is gone, enforcement doesn't restore trust. It accelerates collapse. We can demand secure systems without destroying the people inside them, and if we can't hold that balance, we're admitting the system is weaker than we're willing to admit.
What ties everything we talked about tonight together isn't ideology, party, or even geography. It's precedent. Internationally, we're watching rules bend in the name of urgency. Federally, we're watching authority recalibrated because institutions insulated themselves for too long. Locally, we're watching a woman in Colorado become the embodiment of what happens when someone steps outside the approved lane and refuses to treat systems as sacred. These aren't isolated stories. They're chapters of the same book, written in different fonts for different audiences. And the message running through all of them is simple. Power is becoming less patient with friction, less tolerant of scrutiny, and far more comfortable punishing challenges than answering questions. The most dangerous lie we're told is that stability requires silence, that trust requires obedience, that asking too many questions somehow weakens democracy. History says the opposite. Every durable system, Political, economic, cultural survives because it can withstand pressure from below. When oversight is treated as sabotage, when transparency is framed as threat, when enforcement replaces accountability, the system doesn't get stronger. It gets brittle. And brittle systems don't bend, they break. Not all at once, but slowly, quietly, and usually after they've convinced enough people that resistance is reckless and compliance is maturity. So if there's a takeaway from tonight, it's this. Don't let anyone convince you that curiosity is extremism or that skepticism is disloyalty. Power should be questioned, especially when it insists it's acting for your own good. Whether it's a foreign institution freezing assets, a federal agency rewriting its authority, or a state prosecuting someone into the ground to make an example, the principle is the same. Systems that cannot tolerate scrutiny do not deserve trust. And the responsibility to push back against that doesn't belong to courts, politicians, or media panels alone. It belongs to citizens who refuse to stop thinking. Remember to speak truth. Stir thought. Tonight's episode of Data and Dissonance is brought to you by the Caleb Rourke Thriller series. Because sometimes fiction is the only place where the truth is allowed to be told all the way to the end. If the themes we cover tonight feel uncomfortably familiar, power without accountability, institutions protecting themselves, individuals crushed for asking the wrong questions, that's because those same forces live at the heart of the Caleb Rourke universe. In the Covenant Protocol and the Prophet Directive, Rourke navigates a world where transparency is treated as a threat, loyalty is demanded but never returned, and the cost of pulling on the wrong thread can be everything. These aren't escapist thrillers. They're mirrors, wrapped in action, intelligence tradecraft, and hard moral choices. And the story isn't done. What's coming next digs even deeper into how systems react when control starts slipping, and how far they'll go to preserve the narrative. If you want a break from cable news spin, but still want something that respects your intelligence, the Caleb Rourke series is where fiction meets the questions we're not supposed to ask out loud. You can find the books now on Amazon. Read between the lines before someone tells you not to.